My name is Reyes Aguilar. I recognize a lot of faces from last week. I'm the Associate Dean for Admissions at Financial Aid here. This session is going to be on financing your legal education. But before we get started to the financial aid stuff, I did want to turn a little bit of time over to Julie Nelson so she can talk about the university's test prep program.
Hi. So this message is mainly directed to anyone who wasn't here last week because I gave this spiel last week too. My name is Julie, and I teach the LSAT Prep course through the University of Utah, and many of you are in my class, and the rest of you should be. So I just wanted to let you know about it. It's run through Continuing Education, and the website for Continuing Education is continue.utah.edu, and there should be some information out there, and a raffle. So put your name in the raffle if you'd like to try to get a free class. This is the book that we use, this book that's lovely wrapped in plastic. If you're going to get your own LSAT book, please get this book too. You want the book that's made by the real LSAT people. Our class, the one that we're doing right now, meets on Saturdays. The one that I'm teaching right now meets on Saturdays. We started last week with an intro and a diagnostic test, so if you want to pick up this week, that would be fine. Otherwise, we run the class more or less throughout the year. We usually have a Saturday class and an evening class. Once you've paid for one of the classes, then you can take it free for 3 years. So if you start and then are like, this is really not working out, no problem, you can come back and take it again. The class costs about $800. It includes this book and another book, and we cover all the things that you need to know. This one's getting ready specifically for the October test, but it's really common to take like a class and then maybe not take the test until November or even January. Do you have any questions for me? Yeah.
What's the total length of the class?
So the Saturday class we meet for 8 weeks. So we started last week and we end on October 24th, I think, or 26th, whichever one is this Saturday. And the Tuesday, Thursday class, sometimes it's Tuesday, Thursday, sometimes it's Monday, Wednesday, and it meets for like maybe 5 weeks. Okay, any other questions? Okay, see you then.
Thank you, Julie. We'll do another raffle for the free class when we're about halfway through this. We'll take a little bit of a break. I'm going to not be as I'll call it organized with time last time. I knew about the time I was going to take a break, and I'm just going to get a sense of how we're moving along before I take a break. This will take about an hour and a half. Snacks and what have you are available, so if you get hungry or thirsty, don't hesitate to help yourself, please. Let's get started. The approach I'm going to use in talking to you about financing your legal education is what I call the investment approach. You really should look at what you're going to be doing in allocating your resources towards law school or your legal education as an investment, a long-term investment, just like a retirement plan. Law school is expensive, and people go into debt for that. And it can be kind of daunting to look at it when you're looking at the numbers and just thinking, is it going to be worth it in 3 years? I think it's better to look at it like when you're buying a house or planning for retirement. This is something you're planning for a career, and that career is going to last you 30, 40 years, and how you pay that out over that time period becomes much more manageable as you look at it than if you're just looking at, well, what am I making right out of school 3 years after taking on this debt? And is that the data point and timeline that I'm looking at to make this decision? And I don't think that's necessarily the best approach, and we'll talk about that. But just like in any investments, there's some caveats. And what's up on the screen right now are 3 important phrases. The first is that common investment disclosure. As if any of you have invested in stocks, or once you are through with school and begin looking at your own investment portfolio for retirement, one of the first things you'll notice on the pages as you start opening up prospectuses and things of that nature is there'll be a phrase that states, past performance is no guarantee of future results. And that goes both ways, that when you're looking at a stock, just because it did poorly in the past doesn't mean it's going to continue to do poorly, nor does it mean that if it's done very well in the past, will it continue to do very well. If there were guarantees, just like in the rest of life, there are no guarantees in the investment approach. Kind of ironically, I guess maybe I'll say, if there were those kinds of guarantees, we might not have a need for law schools or lawyers. The second quote is from Warren Buffett, and he stated this back in the early 2000s when there was a stock bubble kind of starting to get really big. And actually, the words that I have bracketed there that say bold, he used the word greedy. And when he was in the interview, they were talking about, what are some of the things he watches out for, and what is his behavior when he starts seeing the market get as volatile as it was at the time. And he said, he's fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful, meaning that at that time, lots of people were jumping into the stock market without much knowledge of what they were getting themselves into, and greed was what was driving them. That they saw people around them and they were seeing news reports about how much money people were making in the stock market, and so they just wanted in. And that created a lot of volatility in the market and uncertainty. And he said that's a time to be worried, is when others are behaving in this way. And so that's when he would back out. But when others were afraid and they themselves weren't participating or backing out, he says that's when he liked to get in. That's when there was lots of opportunity. And I bring this up because this is relevant to where we are right now in law school admissions. In 2009, 2010, the number of people applying to law schools around the United States was over 90,000. Almost 100,000 people were applying to fill 52,000 law seats in 200 plus law schools in the United States. And that was a really difficult time if you were the applicant to get into law school. It was really competitive from your perspective. But with the Great Recession and the economic changes that occurred nationally and specifically in the legal economy, those application numbers precipitously dropped to the point where it's barely around 50,000 now. And that's not to say that there's still 52,000 seats schools are trying to fill. Schools have reduced their class sizes substantially. But there are far fewer people who you will be competing with in the application process. And so that means it's a good time for you. And quite frankly, if you had been applying to law school 10 years ago, it would have been a much harder prospect. What you're going to experience in your application process now is that you're going to have opportunities that others may not have had before them. And so that's good for you from an investment standpoint. But the thing about both these statements is that you have to think well and not act without very serious thought. Just because it looks like it's a good time and the odds are in your favor in applying to law schools doesn't mean that you should do it, and it especially means that you should not do it at any cost. So as you're looking at law school as an investment, the things I want to talk about today is just like you would do in considering a retirement plan and investing for the future, is you need to do some research. Then you need to develop strategy or strategies about what you're getting yourself into. Then you're going to have to start acquiring resources to put into this investment, and then you're going to have to make decisions about where to put those resources in places and use them in ways that are going to be most cost-effective for you. Cost-effective is not the same as absolutely frugal. At some point you may find that you need to put substantial money someplace, but what you want to do is make sure you're putting it in a place that's going to be most effective for you and how it works for you. The thing I want to do, and I guess I'll ask a question before I get to this one. How many of you are in the application process to start law school in fall of 2020? That's this application cycle, way high. Okay. How many of you are more than that? 2 years away, maybe, or a year. Okay, a few of you. So you have a little bit more time. You have about a year and 2 months. For those of you who are in the application cycle now, I want you to think about your debt aversion number before Halloween comes. What do I mean by that? So when you're investing, when you start the investment of money in stocks or in your retirement plans, the person who's helping you with it, the stock advisor, one of the first questions they should have for you is, what is your risk aversion? And what that person will mean when they ask that is, how comfortable are you making risky decisions with your money? If you're not very comfortable doing that, then you're risk averse. If you're not risk averse, that means you're comfortable putting your money into companies, often very new companies, where the potential of growth may be quite high. But along with a high potential for growth, there's also a high likelihood of just losing everything that you put into it. I like to use a couple of examples in the tech world. There was a time in the early 80s, late 70s, when Apple would have been considered a high risk investment, right? But the people who invested in that very early time period of Apple are doing really well right now, even if they just had a few stocks that they purchased. And that risk paid off. At the same time, there was another company that existed. It was called Wang Computers. Has anybody ever heard of Wang Computers? No? Yeah, I do. Because they failed. They were around through the late 80s. Maybe I saw some machines in the late 90s, or early 90s maybe, right? But they're gone now. And so the people who put money into that company and when it was a high risk, basically lost what they invested in. So you need to think about what your debt aversion number is. A pretty substantial portion of people who are graduating from law school have debt. It's over 70% of people who graduate from law school will have some kind of student loan debt. So with that thought in mind, you need to think about, for those of you who are in the application cycle right now, the debt aversion number, what the debt aversion number is for you. And what I mean by that is, when you graduate from law school, or if you're a recent college graduate, and if you borrowed money, if you borrowed student loans, there's a process called exit counseling. That when you get ready to graduate, you're supposed to go into the financial aid office, or you're supposed to go online and go through a process where they inform you how much money you've borrowed during your time as a student, and what you choose the payment plan that you want to go into, and how much your monthly payment will be. But the big thing is you find out how much money you borrowed in that time. So what you want to make a decision on before you start this application process, or you're well into it, is there a number that you would really be bothered by if during that exit counseling you were informed this is how much you borrowed throughout your law school experience? And I think it's important to come up with that debt aversion number before Halloween, because that's going to be before you're really fully engaged in the application process. It's going to be before you start hearing from schools about your admissions. And so you're not emotionally invested in that decision yet. And you can be a little bit more, I'll call it calculating or clinical, about saying this is the number that would really bother me. And what will happen in spring, April, is schools will require you to start making decisions about accepting their offers of admission. And at that point, hopefully what this workshop will do is it'll show you how to work through the numbers and be able to calculate or estimate what kind of debt you're likely to have with a particular school based on the scholarship offers or the financial aid package they have. And if that number is greater than your debt aversion number, you're now on notice that you may be making a decision to accept an offer to attend a school that may put you in a financially uncomfortable situation. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't go to that school. Ultimately, you may have a good reason to go to that school. But you need to make a conscious decision about the financial impact your decision is going to make and whether or not you accept that offer of admission, knowing what you know about the likely debt you'll be entering into. Okay. And then finally, do your due diligence. Your responsibility as you go through this process financially is to make sure you know what you're getting yourself into. Due diligence is a term of art in law. So for those of you who are interested in doing business or commercial law, what you'll do is you'll take a class called Mergers and Acquisitions. And in that class, you'll learn that a part of the process of acquiring a company is the company doing the acquiring has a responsibility to do their due diligence. And it's the task of the lawyer to make sure the company does that right. And in due diligence, it's when the companies are ready to make sure that the deal is about to be finished, the company that is being purchased basically opens all its books up to the company that's buying it and says, here's all the information. Here's our debts, here's our assets, here's the litigation we're in, here's the employment problems we're having, here's all the positives also, but it's informing the purchasing company what they're really buying, warrants and all. And so you as a student getting ready to go to law school need to do your due diligence about whether this is the right decision for you financially and educationally in terms of the career you're seeking to pursue. Okay? All right, so let's start with a little bit of research. So tuition. I've got 3 years of tuition trends here for public schools and private schools. Public schools will charge tuition at both resident and non-resident rates. You know what that means. Last year, for the 18-19 school year, the average tuition for people paying in-state tuition at public schools was a little over $27,000 a year, and people paying non-resident tuition was $40,000 a year. And then for people attending private schools, they were paying almost $48,000 a year. So assuming you're going to go to school full-time, these are the kind of the base numbers that you start with and multiply them by 3 to say what is your total tuition cost over 3 years of law school. Scholarships. The ABA is now collecting scholarship data, and I've got 4 years of data here. There's only 2 categories, public and private. They don't break up public by resident or non-resident because you don't know how the impact of this. They just say, basically, if a school, for all people who are receiving scholarships, and not all students get scholarships, that's what the parenthetical is underneath those numbers. For those who are getting scholarships, this is the average amount per recipient nationally. And so for some of this financial aid data, you'll notice it's 2-year-old information. And that's due to the fact that the way the ABA asks us questions in our reporting to them, they want to make sure the financial aid year has been completed before we give them the data. And so we can't, for example, when we're filling out the questionnaire for this year's data, give them the 2019, 2020 information because there may still be scholarships we offer in April of 2020. So reporting is always a couple of years behind. For the 17-18 school year, the median scholarship amount was $15,000 for people who attended public schools, and 73% of students were on some kind of scholarship at public schools. So that's a pretty good percentage. It's really good relative to going 4 or 5 years back, that we've gone up from roughly 2/3 of students at public schools getting scholarships to almost 3/4. So that's a good thing. That's something in your favor. For people who are attending private schools, that number is $22,000, and a little bit more or a little bit higher percentage of those students were on some kind of scholarships. That was 76%. Okay, debt. I always make this slide a little bit later, so when I talk about that debt aversion number with you, you can ponder that a little bit. But this is something that gives you a good threshold. Some of you, when I said come up with your debt aversion number, may have said, I don't like even $25,000 as a thought. And some of you are like, I'm cool with $200,000 or $300,000. I'm worth a house. I know that there's probably a spectrum out there, at least initially when people were thinking about what would that number be for me. But here's the national numbers. So I've got a lot of data to show the trends. For the class that graduated in 2018, the average debt for students who have debt was almost $87,000. And 75% of students graduating from law school, public law schools, had some kind of debt. And for people who graduated from private schools, that debt was $123,000. It was 6 figures. And 77% of those students have some kind of debt. I was curious when I see people's eyebrows raised. It's a bit of surprise, I know. It's a mortgage. And I think it's helpful, and that's why I emphasize that your approach to this should be one of investment, that it's not unlike purchasing a house. It can be a very good investment, but it's an investment that you have to consider over the long term. And part of that investment is looking at dividends. What are you reaping from your dividends? One of the things that I've been challenged, if any of you have been watching or reading the websites, Reddit, top law schools, those kinds of things, there's been less discussion, but there is still discussion about, is law school really worth it? And the frustration I've had with some of those discussions is they focus on the data that you're looking at right now. What is the salary people have when they come out of law school, and does that signify that the cost of law school has been worth it? And I think that's an important data point to consider, But what that conversation has not included is, well, over the long term, over the lifetime of the person who earns the degree, their career life, has it played out in a good way? And I would argue is even over the time of the recession, it has. For those who were impacted by the recession, it may not have paid off as well as for people who were, employed through the 80s and 90s. But it's still an investment that can pay off, and it can pay off well over the lifetime of the person who does it. It just ties to the expectations of the person. Okay. But these are important numbers to just kind of get a benchmark, a starting point of what people are looking at for salaries. Here again, like the financial aid information, the information we have on employment is about 2 years old. Part of the reason for that is there's a number of people who want to go to work in the public sector. Those are the jobs in the far left-hand column that are government and public interest jobs in particular. Those people can't be hired until about 10 months after, up to 10 months after they've graduated from law school, because what those jobs require is that they be licensed attorneys before they can be hired. And a lot of organizations like the county attorney's office or district attorney's office or public defender's office will tell people, we'd like to hire you, but we can't make the offer until we know you've passed the bar and you've been sworn in. And in some jurisdictions like California and New York, that doesn't happen until January. So the data is collected 10 months after graduation. And so we're just wrapping up the analysis of the people who graduated in 2018. That's how come you see that the year is 2017. Overall employment information, though, is showing that there's been improvements in the legal economy. That overall employment, that top line, 88.6% for the class of 2017, is the overall employment. Whether a person's working in a job as an attorney or the classic barista or working at McDonald's, if they have a job, that's in that percentage. The job, the placement or the job information that people are really interested in is that second percentage number. That's 71.8 for the class of 2017. That's the percentage of people who got jobs nationally in positions that require that they be licensed. And I recognize that that's the reason that most people are going to law school. They want to be licensed attorneys representing clients. But know when you're looking at the data how much of it may apply to you. Because we also know that not everybody goes to law school to be a good practicing attorney. I happen to have taken the bar and I'm licensed, but I'm not in a licensed required job. So actually, my job would not show up in that percentage because bar passage wasn't required for me to be hired. Okay, so know that how relevant is some of the data. That's part of your obligation in reading the research. How does it pertain to your situation? So be aware of that. But overall, the news is good as a trend that we're seeing a higher percentage of people are getting into jobs that require bar passage. Salaries are going up, and the percentage of people, especially in the private sector, tends to be going up. That's a good sign in terms of the legal economy. So overall, the median salary nationally was 70%, and they break down in these various areas. The smallest percentage of area where people go to work is in education. And education is any kind of job on a campus, whether it's a professor or a director or a person who works in the contracting office. It's just in education. Just like in business, this business doesn't represent people who are working in the general counsel's office. It can be people who are working in HR or purchasing or something. And there's lots of jobs in business where the JD is an advantage, but it's not just in the general counsel's office. So you can see the distribution of the salaries. It's a pretty wide distribution. I think when people look at the numbers, they're somewhat surprised that salaries have as broad a distribution as 50,000 in public interest, which I think is kind of cruel. Some of the most important work that is done by attorneys is in this field, but it's also the lowest paying field. Be aware of that. If that's your area of interest, this is one of the difficult realities you're going to have to face in terms of the salaries you're likely to be earning. And then the high end is in private sector work. And 55% of people, roughly 55% of the class of 2017, almost 55%, went into that field. Here again, that's an increasing number. I'm showing you this to show the data trends, in part because there's fluctuations in the market, but it also shows the trends as things like recessions hit the legal economy. And so, for example, when we were kind of in the throes of the Great Recession, hiring in the private sector dropped to less than half the graduating class getting jobs in the private sector. So something to think about there. And, there is talk of a recession. So, in terms of what your expectations are in going into to law school and graduating in a particular field, knowing how robust that field is may be something that's important to you. But here's the 54.5. Where people ended up going to when the recession hit was in business. That picked up some of the hiring slack there. What we tended to find is the salaries were lower, but businesses were more willing to look at JDs and to work in their HR or purchasing offices or other areas where a legal training, whether it's your ability to analyze or your writing skills, can play a role in that market. So this is where the slack tended to be picked up. Pretty much everything else stayed relatively consistent through those difficult times, except perhaps for public interest. It did pick up, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the distribution of jobs. When the economy hit and it was not going so great, people were willing to take those lower paying jobs, and I think the public interest market saw an opportunity there. But also with public service loan forgiveness existing at that point, that more people started looking at this and saying, well, it can be a pretty good job, and I don't have to worry so much about the salary because I can do income-based repayment, and my loans can be forgiven in 10 years. So that might have played a little bit of a role in terms of people being directed into public interest work a little bit at a bit of a higher rate. So I want to talk a little bit about private sector work now also, because there's even variance in that. There's often talk about working in big law and making the kind of money that big law pays. And as I showed you in that slide a couple of slides ago, that's a six-figure salary. That's $117,000 median that those folks were making. But here's some more precise information in regard to how you slice and dice the information coming out of the private sector. So for the salary ranges, the biggest increases in the private sector salaries have tended to be in the firm sizes of more than 100. That's where we're seeing bigger jumps in the annual salary as the economy improved. Okay? And actually, people who are working in smaller firms, less than 50, they're somewhat more comparable to public sector type jobs, that $50,000 to $60,000 a year salary range. Okay. Another thing to note is where people are working within the private sector. So in 2011, kind of in that worst of the recession, only 16% of new attorneys who were working in the private sector were working in large firms, right? And now it's jumped back up to almost 30%. Okay, so things are rolling. And the biggest increases we saw in small firms or solo practitioners was in that kind of same time period. So that's where the distribution is. Something I also want to note is for firms of 50 or less, for this year, 54% of people in the private sector were in these firms. So it's a slight majority of people working in the private sector are in smaller firms. Okay, so that's also one of the realities of the market. And then finally, one thing I want to talk about in terms of the research is what's called the bimodal graph in salary distribution. It's also sometimes referred to as the inverted graph. And the bimodal refers to the fact that there's roughly two humps when you look at the data. That when you're looking at how salaries are distributed among people who graduated in the class of 2016, we have this clump in this kind of $55,000 to $65,000 range, which is that public sector, government, and business folk. And then this other hump in the higher paying private sector. And that when we report data like medians or averages, The thing that's weird about salaries in law school reporting or legal practice reporting is the frequency or the number of people who are earning money at that median or at that average is actually fairly small. In most cases, and the assumptions I often make when I hear statistics is when somebody says the median of blah is X, I think of a traditional bell-shaped curve, and the highest frequency coincides with that median. So the highest number of people earning that median, or that median is being earned by the highest number of people. The frequency is quite high. But actually here, the frequency is quite low, and it's pulled in two directions by those two very different categories of salaries. Right? That's something important to know, because as you look at the data, always have in mind when they're reporting the median, that's a middle point where there's probably a binomial graph associated with that school. Any questions about the statistics I've provided you with so far? So, and I forgot to mention this as I began talking. I'll provide you with the slides, so for everybody who signed in and registered, I'll send you a PDF of the slides so you have this data. And at the bottom of the slides, I have the sources. Most of the information I gathered for you guys here came out of the ABA's 509 reports. This is where you can do a lot of your research for yourself. Just Google ABA disclosures and it'll take you to this page. Or if you just want to go to the law schools themselves, on the front page or their landing page for their websites, we have an obligation that we have to meet for our accreditation where we have our 509. It's called the 509 report posted, where you just click a link and it'll take you to the page with all the data that we just talked about, most of the data that we just talked about. One of the best things if you're looking at a number of schools is this one, because this is where you can put in a year, put in what you're looking for, salary data or admissions data, and it'll give you all the data for all the ABA accredited schools in a spreadsheet, so you can make easy comparisons on that, on an Excel spreadsheet. If you do it here, then you get all the information for just the one school. It's an easy way to get all the information, but just play with it, okay? So I did that for you. You're welcome. All right. Now the core of what I'm assuming you signed up for and coming here. How does this work? What do I mean by financing legal education? Well, it's meaning all the costs associated with this. As an investment, you're needing to look at all the costs that you're putting into this process, and that's going to include the application phase, the enrollment term for 3 years that you're a full-time student, and then that year of licensing. Sometimes people are surprised that we're already talking about licensing. But remember when I alluded to the fact that if people are looking at wanting to go into public sector work, they need to be licensed before they can get a job? There's a lot of costs associated with that. And sometimes people are really caught off guard by the fact that when they start signing up to sit for the bar, if they're looking at a jurisdiction like California or New York, they may graduate from law school in May, they sit for the bar in July, then it'll take from July to November for the bar results to be disclosed. So the person only finds out in November that they've passed the bar. But because in those jurisdictions so many people are sitting for the bar, they don't do the character and fitness check until after they know who has passed. They don't want to waste their time checking up on people who did not pass. So it's from November to late December that they're doing the character and fitness check on everybody who passed. And that's why they're not getting sworn in until January, the year after they graduate. So having a plan and how you're going to support yourself, pay for the bar, pay for the licensing fee during that 9 to 10 month period is something you should be thinking about now. Okay, I'm going to break down strategy in a couple of areas. One is just establish good money handling habits. It sounds a bit paternalistic talking about things as simple as budgeting, but it matters not only from a financial standpoint, but from a character and fitness standpoint. Do know this, that as part of your character and fitness check, when you get ready to sit for the bar, you're going to be filling out about a 40-page document, questions and answers, and a lot of releases. And one of the releases you're going to sign off on is giving the bar examiner's authority, or the bar authority, to go into your financial records, to look at your financial background. Because the bar knows in terms of patterns of behavior, especially patterns of behavior as it relates to finances. If there's a person trying to become an attorney who can't handle their money, they should be worried. The bar should be worried for the clients because attorneys are very uniquely situated in American culture. Attorneys are the only people who, as professionals, have a right to or will have rights to their client's money. Whether it's because the client hired them to set up a trust and the attorney is a trustee for the trust and has the checkbook and is paying the accountant to do the taxes and those kind of things, or the client gives the attorney a retainer. And a retainer technically is not an attorney's money. A retainer is a bunch of money that a client will give to an attorney and in order to say, I'm going to be good for this case. But the attorney doesn't have a right to that money until he or she earns it. So it goes into a special account, which the attorney is not supposed to access until he or she reports to the client what they've done to earn the money, and then the attorney can pull it out. But during that time period, it's the attorney's bank account that the attorney has access to, her or himself, to use that money. And because of those two examples and others, the bar associations want to make sure that attorneys that they're licensing are trustworthy and are dependable with their finances in a way as to not be tempted to use those funds to make payroll or pay for student loans or to do things of that nature. And that's why they put you through a credit check in your character and fitness check. And so if you have a really bad financial history in terms of lots of delinquencies on your credit cards, you're not paying your debts, you've defaulted on a student loan, if you have a lot of student loans that they should be worried about, that can lead to you being called in during the character and fitness check for an interview to see, what led to this. So it's not just about good budgeting, it's about your character and fitness. If you're a student and you've been living on your debit card and you really never know what is in your account, what have you, just know that if on all campuses in Utah, I would say that in the student union building, there's usually money management offices that can help you with kind of figuring out how to manage your finances if you need some basic help. Second thing, or as it relates to budgeting, I like to mention, and this is through personal experience, both my own and observation as an associate dean. One of the things that happens in law school is there is a concentration of wealth. That what you'll find when you go to law school, there's a good number of people in your class who are they themselves financially well off, or they are the spouses or children of people who are very financially successful. And they're able to live a very good lifestyle. And sometimes it's those students who set the culture for the school in terms of how much people are going out to dinner and what they're doing on Thursday and Friday nights and what they're doing for fall break and spring break and what health clubs they belong to and things like that. Know that you'll have access to a lot of resources in law school. You're going to have the student loans, the federal student loans that you can borrow, and then credit card companies will love you. Credit card companies love doctors and people who are going to medical school, law school, and MBA programs because you have, on average, good earning potential and you're a good risk. So you'll start getting the emails. Here's our credit card. We're going to give you a $5,000 limit right out of the chutes, blah, blah, blah. So if you're living on your student loans and on those credit cards and essentially living the life of an attorney because you're going on nice vacations and you're living in a nice apartment complex and you're driving a nice car, you're living like a lawyer. Right? But once you become a lawyer, you get to live as a student because you're going to have to pay all the fun you had back in those 3 years. You're going to have to pay the money back for that lifestyle. So just be cautious of that and don't get caught up in lifestyle choices that may be driven by folks that don't have the financial challenges that you may have. Okay, second part of strategy. First of all, develop a 3-part plan. Plan for paying for the application process, a plan for paying for the 3 years of law school, and a plan for paying for your year of licensing. Know what the budgets are for each of those. We'll cover those next. Investigate the funding options. And this is what trips people up a little bit, I think, in the application to law school part. The exciting thing that's going on this year for many of you is the thought of going to law school. And it can be fun. It can be exciting writing your personal statement, getting that packet of information, contemplating where you're going to be a year from now in terms of the classroom. And then there's this boring side of it, the financial aid, filling out the federal forms, filling out applications. But it's important to put yourself through that part of the process so you have that done when it comes time to make decisions about where you're going to accept your offers of admissions in April. Because if you haven't done that paperwork, they're not going to give you extra time to do it before they require you to make your decision. So investigate that and do the paperwork. Compare all costs. At the application workshop that I told you about last week, at the application workshop last week, I told you about the law fairs that are being held here and at BYU. At those events, what I often see people ask to compare schools by cost is just asking what the tuition rate is at a school. That's not comparing all costs. When you want to compare all costs for schools, for example, it's important to know what tuition is because that's a part of that. The real question you should be asking is, what's the total cost of attendance? The cost of attendance is a phrase that schools know what it means because the federal government tells us what it means. The cost of attendance is the number that schools have to demonstrate to the federal government that they've investigated through surveys and data to say what it costs to go to their institution to cover tuition, books and supplies, room and board, technology if you need it, all these things on this list. And so obviously tuition and fees are a part of it, but what you may find is if you're only asking tuition question to compare schools, if you're asking a public school in a high-cost urban area what their tuition is and making an assumption based on that, you're missing out on how expensive it is to live in this high-cost urban area. And then conversely, you may be looking at a private school, and if you're only looking at their tuition, which appears to be high, if they're located in a low-cost rural area, their total cost is driven down because it's less expensive to live there. And if you ask that, what is your cost of attendance budget question, you'll find that those schools may be very comparable in total cost. So make sure you know what you're asking, and you're asking all the questions as it relates to that. Consider and have contingency plans. I used to talk hypothetically about this a long time ago, but then the Great Recession hit, and I saw real-life examples of think about situations in which if you lose a resource, a financial resource, if part of your plan to go to law school includes your parents helping you out or having a spouse who's got a job on campus and you get the 50% tuition waiver, and if a really bad recession hits and your parents lose their job or their stock portfolio is really significantly impacted or your spouse loses the job, and so not only is that income lost, but the half tuition break is lost. What do you do then? And so thinking a little bit about that before something bad happens can be helpful because for people who didn't plan it, they're sitting there spinning their wheels about, well, what now, what now, what now? And if you're like, well, if I'm at a full-time school, maybe I can go part-time. Or if I'm living in the same town as my parents, I may be in an apartment, but I can move back at home. Or maybe I just take a leave of absence. I just take a leave and just kind of cool my jets and see what happens with the economy. But having a plan in place and being ready to act on that plan is going to put you in a much better position if, for example, your plan is to stay in school, you're not disrupting your studies to deal with this financial problem that hits. And so it's important to, it's cliche, it's what our grandparents always told us, but, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And if it doesn't end up being the worst, you're in a pretty good position. Okay. Then finally, ask the hard questions of yourself and the law school. So I'll give you an example of that here in a minute. So I want you to make you aware that for most of you, you're probably well into it now, but the LSAT and cash report fees have been restructured. This happened this summer. And so there's actually some payment options. If you look at packages 1 and 2, you pay slightly less. There is some cost savings by paying that $650 up front to register for the LSAT and the CAS and do your 6 law school reports. And we know this 6 law school reports is a good number because that's the national average for the number of schools people apply to. So if you're looking at those 6 schools, just kind of getting that all paid for and out of the way will save you a little bit. It's not a lot. It's maybe 10%, I think, once you do that. Or you can pay kind of piecemeal for these services. I know that some people may not be certain that they want to apply to law school this year. They might be applying for Teach for America. It might be out for a couple of years before they apply to law school. So they just want to get the LSAT out of the way, and that will always be an option. But that's the structure now. So this budget for applying to law school. For those of you who are in the process now, you've quickly realized that you're getting hit for $150 and $200 every time you turn around, right? So signing up for the LSAT, $200. Signing up for the Credential Assembly Service Report, if you didn't do that, big cost. It's another $200, and then $45 for each of the law schools that reports that you sign up for, which if you're doing 6, so that's up to $240. And then if you're applying to 6 law schools, for those schools that have application fees, they average about $50, $60, so that's another $650 there. So as you can see, it just kind of keeps adding up. And these are fixed costs. These aren't going to go away. So you're looking at $850 to almost $1,100 in fixed costs just for the application process. So you need to plan for that. And then there's the variable expenses. Guidebooks. Like I always tell people, that can go away really quick. There's this crazy thing called the internet. LSAT Prep course. I like to use this for a resource allocation example. I know we had Julie come in and talk about the LSAT Prep course, and I think it's $800. So I put $1,200 there because I think that's what Kaplan charges. I've always been surprised when I look at the data. They do kind of exit surveys of people pretty regularly when they leave the LSAT. And one of the questions they commonly ask is, well, how did you prepare? And it's usually a pretty consistent majority. It's not like a crazy majority, like 90%, but it's usually in that 50 or it's usually in that about 60% range of people say, I just did myself, self-prep. Just got a book and I prepped. And I'm always surprised. I shouldn't say surprised. I understand that some people look at this $1,200 and say, that's a lot of money. And if I'm a student who doesn't have a job, that's just an expense that if I can prep on my own, I'll do it. I'm surprised, though, because you guys are smart. And if you think about it, are you a self-prep person? That if you were to look back on your college time and say to yourself, what classes did I do best in? And if the class you did best in was one where you went the first day of school, you got the textbook, you got the syllabus, you didn't really like the professor, so you just studied on your own, you pulled an A, then you might be that self-prep person. But if you're the kind of person whose performance was best in classes where the professor provided you a detailed syllabus and followed it, and she regularly tested your progress along the way, whether it was actual tests or quizzes or surveys of the class, but you had a sense of how you were progressing. And this class was very structured, well-structured along those lines. And that's a setting in which, you do better. It's an example of you doing better with structure. And quite frankly, that's what LSAT prep courses do. They provide you structure. You know where you're going to be every Wednesday or Saturday. The first 6 weeks are going to be covering the questions and seeing which section of the test is really more challenging for you. You can pay more attention to it. And then maybe the last 2 or 3 weeks are going to be just practice test and practice test and practice test. And if that's a structure which you will perform better in, then put a financial link to that. And this is going to be the return on investment formula. So I'm bad at math, so let's just make it really easy round numbers. Let's say the test prep class is $1,000. And does anybody remember what the average scholarship was for public schools? That slide? $15,000, right. So let's say you did a diagnostic test with the test prep folks, and it was a free one, so you didn't have to sign up for the class, but you just saw how you were doing. And you scored in what is the national average, 150. And if you're trying to get into a school like ours, you need to be in a 160, 159 range. Okay? So you got some work ahead of you. Now, if you're prepping on your own and you see yourself kind of getting along there, but you're getting to that 153, 155, and you're kind of stuck, but you also think a little bit about, well, you're doing it at the kitchen table and TV's on, your roommates are playing Xbox and you're playing Xbox with them sometimes, and is it really proving effective? Well, and you can't get over that. But if you put in that money and you take advantage of the class and you find that you pick up those 4 other points by using that class, you may have spent $1,000. But what you find is if you not only get into a school that you may not have been competitive in, that's not a set number. You're going to have to put the value of getting into the school on yourself. But if you get the average scholarship, which is $15,000 as a result of that, then the return on investment is $14,000. Put $1,000 into this prep, and then if you got the scholarship, then there was a payoff in it. And then there's that difficult to measure payoff of more opportunities. So I like to use that as the example of resource allocation. Think about, you might have to put some money up front, but and it might be difficult to come up with the money, but the impact, the positive impact that allocation makes in opportunities for maybe more schools to gain admission into that you may not have been as competitive with before, or larger scholarship amounts, is how the payoff plays out. Okay? So that's the example of resource allocation. Now the example of due diligence, remember I talked about due diligence, is in the school visit side of things. And there's a question mark. The question marks in those last three categories are there is because that's the impossible thing for me to measure, quite frankly. For people who, for whatever reasons, are committed to being in Utah, there's two great law schools, and if these are the only two law schools you're applying to, then the school visits are a half tank of gas, right? And maybe whatever it costs you to miss work on a day. But if you're applying to 6 schools, 3 of them are in New England and 2 of them are in Seattle and another is in Colorado, then for school visits, you're going to have to fly someplace. And that's going to drive up those costs really substantially. So that's how come there's question marks there. But it's very important. It's one of the most important parts of this process because this is where, is where that due diligence of the books are opened up to you. You guys know this. We market to you. We've got great websites. We've got we have a marketing office, so they craft our messages and they take the pictures of our happiest, best-looking students talking to our happiest, best-looking faculty. And the picture in the classroom has sunshine, the sunset on an inversion list day, and all those great things that make it look like I want to be one of those people, right? But what the class visit will do is it'll put you in the seat, right? And there's a lot to be said, I think, for just sitting in a classroom and hearing the questions, or sitting in a classroom 5 minutes before class starts and talking to people or hearing the conversations. Or if you're a parent and you're going to have a child going to law school with you, what are the neighborhoods like where your kid is going to be living with you, and are you going to have close access to the school and the law school as well as good schools for your child? Then there's just kind of the vibe of the school that is walking through the halls and things like this. It may sound silly to you, but one of the things that when I did this, my mom's a lot smarter than I, so I wasn't planning on visiting law schools. I had my list, I had U.S. News next to me, got into the schools, said, all right, I can now go drink beer and be happy I know where I'm going. And she's like, no. She's like, we don't come from wealth, so I wasn't able to visit all the schools. But she said, I'll help you visit 3 schools. I had been admitted, I had applied to 5 schools, and luckily was admitted to all 5, but I had to quickly get 2 that I would choose not to go to, and I could only choose 3. She goes, you need to visit them. And so I did. And I did kind of the standard sit in the class thing and talk to professors, and those had an impact. But one of the things that also impacted me, kind of going to that vibe thing, is the highest ranked school that I got into, which was a T14. One of the things I noticed is there was very little laughter in the hallways. It was a very somber place. And I have what I think is a pretty good sense of humor, and I like to be happy. And one of the things that caught me about the school I ended up at was there was laughter in the hallway. It wasn't, jovial, crazy, good time stuff all the time, but there was this sense of people being pleased with where they were or having a good day. And that was just one of the things I noticed. It wasn't the final decision maker, but it played into it. And what you may find is as you're doing your due diligence visits, is there are little things that you hadn't thought of that bugged you a little bit or made you more comfortable in a way that you hadn't anticipated. And you only get those when you're sitting in a classroom or you're walking through a neighborhood or you're talking to a person who's actually going through the experience you're about to go through a year from now. So these are really important. My advice on these is crowdsourcing. If you haven't set aside money for these visits, one of the things that you can do, I think, is, especially if you're going to be a recent college graduate or an upcoming college graduate, is let people know you're in the applicant pool and set up a crowdsourcing page and just say, instead of giving me a graduation gift, it would really help me if you would contribute to my law school travel fund and help me get, flights or tickets to schools. Or if you know people who travel a lot, this is a Delta hub. So there are a lot of people who travel a lot from business here in Salt Lake City. And one of those people are in your lives, just be bold, almost like that Warren Buffett quote. Be bold and ask them, say, look, I'm graduating from school soon. We're close friends. I'm guessing you're going to probably give me a graduation gift. Instead of giving me something like an expensive pen or briefcase, can I ask you just to give me Sky Miles? It won't cost you anything, and it'll get me to Boston. So I need 25,000 Sky Miles. And quite frankly, if they travel a lot, they're going to be happy because that's not going to cost them anything, and they don't have to be original in the gift they give you. All right. Same thing with hotels and things like that. But be creative in terms of trying to find resources, because I can't emphasize how important this due diligence part is as it relates to visiting the schools you're looking at. For those of you who have already signed up for the LSAT, this is a little late. For those of you who are a year and a half away from applying to law school, this is something to look at. The Law School Admission Council does have LSAT and CAS fee waivers. And they're financially based. So kind of the threshold I always tell people is if you're on a full Pell Grant, you probably qualify for this. And if you do get it, that has a value of almost $800. Okay? It waives 2 LSAT fees. It gives you a cash report, and then 4 law schools as part of that, or 4 law school reports as part of that. And then the Khan Academy now has free LSAT Prep. Do I have a slide on that? So how many of you have heard of that? Okay. So my suggestion is if money is tight and you really don't know if you can afford an LSAT test prep, is try the Khan Academy for a while. It's really well organized. If you're an online learner, it can be really beneficial. Now that the test is digital, it kind of has a navigation and a platform probably that's more akin to what you will experience on the LSAT than just doing the book thing. And if it's working for you, that's great. And it's great because it's free. But at least if you start with that and it's not working for you, that hasn't cost you anything. And you've done really all you can in a well-organized, structured, free system. And maybe having to go to an in-person test prep is where you need to go. But give yourself enough time to try it out. Okay, part 2. We good? You guys need to take a break? Good? Okay. Part 2, the enrollment. How are you going to pay for the 3 years of law school? So you go through law school. A couple things I forgot to mention. Know that there's seat deposits or tuition deposits at schools. Those can be really expensive. They can be upwards of $1,500, $2,000, if not more. You'll see that money in the future because they'll apply it toward your tuition once you enroll, but you have to come up with it in April. So anticipate that. That's sometimes a big hit that people take. And then know that moving expenses are part of financial aid budgets in terms of qualifying for financial aid to kind of pay you back to move to wherever you're going to law school. So keep that in mind. And quite frankly, that sometimes bites people in a couple of ways. What I find is sometimes, especially there's so many families here in Utah, that that a person may choose to go out of state, but they want to be here in the long term for jobs. So they go out of state for law school, but then they're having to pay the cost of coming back here for summer jobs. If they want to bring the family with them, it can get really expensive moving a family back and forth for 2 and 3 month jaunts. So anticipate those costs and be realistic about whether that's something you're willing to do. Okay, enrollment. Establish 1 and 3 year budget plans. Resource acquisition. Get the free money first, knowing what you need and knowing what can be borrowed as opposed to you need to borrow. That goes back to the cost of attendance budget. These are the things that go into the cost of attendance budget in this circumstance plays a different role than just the information gathering at the beginning of the process. Now this budget plays the role of informing you, and these are realistic things. Since we have to follow federal guidelines and how we come up with this, you can rely on these numbers and what it's going to cost you. Now what the role this number plays in the financial aid world is this is the maximum amount of money you're going to be able to get to go through law school in a year. So you cannot get more than your cost of attendance budget and loans, scholarships, or work study. So just you have to work on that. And that you have to work with that figure. And that sometimes gets folks because these are the expenses that are not allowed in the cost of attendance budget. They don't take into consideration what it costs to be a student, a car or consumer debt. So if you have a fairly new car with really expensive monthly payments or insurance payments, your cost of attendance budget isn't going to cover that. The support of a spouse. This is, I don't think it's a very helpful rule, but it's a federal rule. And it can sometimes be difficult for families when they have 2 or 3 kids, because we all know, those of us who have kids, that it is sometimes more expensive for the spouse to have a job and put the kids in daycare than just to stay home with the kids. But the federal government doesn't care at that point. They're just like, no, if there's a spouse, the spouse has to support him or herself. And if there are children, then the spouse is expected to support the children, not including what they call dependent care. And what they refer to as dependent care is if you have to get daycare while you're in class, if you have the receipts for that cost, there's a formula they attach to that says they'll reimburse, they'll increase your cost of attendance to reflect that. But they're not going to give you more money to have that extra bedroom or to buy diapers or the food costs. So plan for the frugality that may have to come into play for that. Consumer debt, credit card debts, those kinds of things. Periods of non-enrollment. So the cost of attendance budget takes into account what it is to be a student for a 9-month school year, including 9 months of apartment rent. So you're expected to support yourself during the summer, but you can get summer school financial aid if you go to summer school for more than 5 credits during the summer. So that is not initially allocated to you. You just have to notify the financial aid office in March, usually about, that I plan to go to summer school, and they'll give you a new cost of attendance budget for that period, which will include all the things that we just talked about. So that's how people sometimes address that if they don't have a summer job, so they go to summer school. And then, as I mentioned, relocation expenses. So in your enrollment plan, that's how it's easy to get the 1 and 3 year budgets. Once you find out or make decisions, so when you're investigating schools, look at the 1 year budgets and make comparisons that way. And then once you've made your decision on the school that you plan to attend, make a 3 year budget. You take that cost of attendance budget, multiply it by 3, and it's going to be a really big, scary number. Know this, there's costs associated with going to school that you're going to have to incur no matter what. Housing and food are the best 2 examples. So there's those costs that kind of mitigates the impact there. And even though it's going to be a large number, at least you got something to put your hands around and you can start chipping away at it. And we'll get to that in terms of the resource acquisition. But once you look at that 3 year cost of attendance budget, also think about, are there things I can do periodically to bring some of these costs down? So for example, if you end up choosing to go to an out-of-state school and you're a non-resident your first year, find out whether you can get residency for tuition purposes by your 2nd and 3rd year. And if you can, plan on doing that. There may be costs associated with that. You might have to re-register your car. You might have to pay income tax in that state or something like that. So figure that into it. But then that can drive that in-state tuition down $10, $15. So that's $30,000 maybe savings over that 3 year budget that you can take out of because you can get residency and you do what you need to. Here's a combination of savings and resource allocation. One of the things that helped me when I went through law school was in my first year, I told myself I wasn't going to get a roommate my first year. And there was a little bit higher cost. I didn't get a 1-bedroom apartment. I got a studio, but I was paying for everything. That was the additional cost. So I was paying all my rent, all my utilities, all my stuff there myself. But my thinking was, I'll call it a victim of the crazy roommate freshman year experience in undergrad. Right? The guy was a nut. And I know that affected my performance. And I know first year grades play a very important role in job opportunities in law schools. So I wanted to make sure that I was in a situation where nothing could affect me, at least that I had control over in my living situation in terms of preparing for class. So I committed to the idea of living by myself and paying a little bit more my first year, but then said I would get roommates for my second and third years. So in my situation, I got in-state tuition second and third years and drove some of my costs down by sharing a house with 2 other people and had savings there. So play with your 3-year budget that way and chip away at some of those costs. And then you'll still have a big number. You can put your hands around it, though, and say, all right, how am I going to fund this number? And then you look at your resources. Free money. That's scholarships, right? Know that there's 2 types of scholarships. There's need-based scholarships and merit scholarships. Unfortunately, fewer and fewer schools are offering need-based scholarships, but they still exist. Just know that you're going to have to do the paperwork for them. You're going to have to fill out forms. You're going to have to do the federal financial aid stuff. And for some schools, you're going to have to give them your parents' financial information. And it can be annoying because I can tell you for the federal student loan programs, you don't need parental information. And for a lot of public schools, including ours and our need-based scholarships, we don't want to know parental information, but some schools do. So you might need to bug your parents for tax information. It's strictly formulaic. If you show the need and it's within their budget, then you get the aid, and if you don't, you don't get the aid. Pretty straightforward, but that's need-based scholarships. Then there are merit scholarships. Merit scholarships fall into 2 very large categories. Merit on entrance scholarships and merit for continuing student scholarships. Sometimes the information is in different places for schools. Merit scholarships for continuing students will often be on the current student's webpage. So make sure you're navigating websites kind of all over the place to look for this information. The financial aid page, the admissions page, and the current students page. And then if it's part of a university, the university's financial aid page too. So you're looking at all the potential resources to access money, especially merit money. For the merit on entrance scholarships, there's also 2 categories. Merit on entrance scholarships that are renewable and merit scholarships for a term. Merit scholarships for a term is like the name implies. You just get it for a semester term or a 1-year term. And once you've done that, the money's gone and you don't get any more of that money. It doesn't mean you can't qualify for merit scholarships for continuing students, but you're competing for those. Okay? Merit scholarships that are renewable will be renewed. And the easiest renewability scholarships are the ones that say all you have to do is not be in behavioral trouble and not flunk out, and you'll get the money next year. So those are the best ones. And then some of them will have will have conditions associated with either class GPA performance or class rank performance. Under ABA rules, schools that offer you those kinds of scholarships are supposed to give you an additional form or pay a document that shows how many the students the year prior to your offer got this kind of scholarship, and of those students, how many lost it. So as a consumer, you know kind of the odds of that. If a school doesn't include that, reach out to them and say, where's the form? And the name evades me right now. There's an ABA name for the form. One thing that some schools do, and this goes into that hard questions part of that slide that I showed you early in this process, is if a school isn't upfront with you with that form that I just told you about, also ask them, if they give you a GPA, say, what is the rough class rank of that GPA? And if they say, all right, and know this, if it's GPA, don't equate it to undergrad. Law school GPAs are all over the place. In some schools, a 3.25 might be the top half of the class. In other schools, it might be the bottom quarter of the class. So always ask in conjunction with the GPA, what is the class rank associated or percentile associated with that GPA? If they tell you that's top 25%, the follow-up question is, how many students are getting the kind of scholarship offer that I'm getting in the first year class? And if they respond 50% or half the class, you're on notice that half the people getting the scholarship offer are going to lose it their second year. just because of the standards that they're holding it. I think the hard question you can ask the school is, why do you do this? Right? Why do you make a scholarship offer where you know half the people who are on the scholarship are going to lose it? And see what their response is. If it's a school that you're really interested in, though, it may be something that you're willing to consider. But then the hard question you have to ask yourself is, where are you in that pool? And you will have the data. You will know what your LSAT and what your GPA is, and you're going to be able to look at that school's medians, their 25th and 75th percentiles for the last entering class, and where did you fall within that group? And if you're in that top quarter of the group, then yeah, you may, on the odds, be very competitive for hanging on to that scholarship. If not, then you have to ask yourself that hard question: is it worth the risk for me? And you may feel very comfortable saying, yeah, my GPA is based on a hard science, and I know there's not as much grade inflation, and yeah, I'm confident in my performance for that. But that's part of that due diligence and asking yourself the hard questions, as well as the school the hard questions. Okay. For merit on entrance scholarships, what you can find, and you can ask the schools this at the law fairs here at BYU. Some schools are very formulaic even with that. They'll say if you have X LSAT and Y GPA, here's the grid that says the kind of scholarship you'll get from us. Other schools, and we're one of those schools, are a little bit more holistic. There is definitely a correlation in terms of the higher your LSAT and the higher your GPA, the higher the likelihood you will get a scholarship, and the larger the amount of the scholarship in most cases. But we take a holistic view of it in the sense that we don't do a grid or automatic scholarship awarding at admissions. Our process is one where after you're admitted, you go through a separate review, a comparative review for scholarship consideration, where we're looking at everybody who's been admitted up to that point and saying, where do we want to distribute the money? And I'd be lying if I said the numbers didn't play a role into it. But for our most valuable scholarships, we're also looking at what kind of fit is the student going to make for our school. Because we want people who are going to be participating in our biolab center, or our bylaw center, people who are participating in the Stegner Center. We got, some really sharp people. So maybe somebody has a pretty strong LSAT, not such a strong GPA, but when we look at the GPA, they're a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy. And that is a notorious school for very little grade inflation. So somebody with a 3.25 out of West Point is actually probably in the top quarter of their class. And so we take a hit on the GPA reporting, but this is the kind of student we want. So, even, the schools that people have attended come into play. So know that. One of the things I tell people for schools like ours, where we're looking at everything and making our scholarship decision, is just like I alluded to in regard to investigating financial aid. Look in other places of the school's website to help you develop your personal statement. Because when we're awarding your merit on entrance scholarships, we're reading the personal statements and the letters of recommendation and the resumes. And the better the fit the student makes for us, the more excited we're going to be about wanting to attract them to our school. So I always encourage students to go to the alumni page of a school and look at the most recent dean's letter to the alumni, because in that most recent dean's letter, it's basically a fundraising letter where the dean is she's going to be talking about the school and bragging about all the accomplishments that have been happening, talking about the new scholarship programs that have been developed, the new centers that are opening, the new hires that have been made for the faculty, and the aspirations of the school. And in looking at that document, you can see that if, for example, there's a new center or a new hire or a new professorship, they often want students engaged with that. So there may be a professor who has a chair that they've been awarded, and as part of that awarding of the chair, there may be funds for the professor to hire a research assistant, things like that. So, mentioning specifically, I've seen that you have hired Professor Smith, who is an expert in Middle Eastern law. And I would look forward to working with them because as a veteran, I was also trained in Arabic, and I feel that I would be very helpful in translating work or my interest in the issues that as it relates to Middle Eastern law, things like that, where you make a better connection with the school. And it's not just kind of based on the financial aid or admissions website, which we often see refers back to, but things that are happening within the school most recently. Okay, so that's a little hint I like to give people. And that can help you not only in obviously scholarships, but just for general admissions. So you're welcome. Resource portfolio. Diversify your resource portfolio. So like what happened in 2010, 11, when people really lost a lot in the financials and energy sectors of the stock market. People who had all their money in those sectors really took a big hit. People who diversified their portfolios, they took hits, but some of the areas survived a little bit better. So I always advise students to kind of spread around the resources that they're going to turn to help get them through school, so that they should be using some work, some scholarship, maybe some loan money. Obviously, you want to stay away from the loans as much as you can, but if you're that 75% of the students, you're needing to do that, but you don't want to exclusively rely on that. And so by having a diverse portfolio, if something does happen to one part of that portfolio, you've got those other resources to kind of help float you along, even though you may need to tighten your belt. That will include things like savings. You should be saving now for the start of law school. If you have $1,500 saved between now and the start of law school, that's $1,500 you don't have to borrow for books. And that's $1,500 that will not accrue interest at 6% over the 3 years you're in law school and recapitalize over your 10 years of repayment. And that can add up really quickly. So even smaller amounts can pay off in the long run. So start saving now. When you're in law school, start saving for that year of licensing. Create a little bit of a nest egg so that as you get toward your third year and you need money to pay for your bar licensing or your bar exam registration fees, which are like $400 or $500, you have that money to pay. You don't have to put on a credit card or borrow money for that, okay? So enough about savings. Work. A lot of schools will either flat out prohibit you from working in your first year of law school or strongly discourage you from working. We're one of the schools that falls into the category of strongly discouraging you from working. But for second and third years, work. Schools have an expectation, quite frankly, that you're working, in part because that's what's going to help set up your network for your future jobs. So the benefit of working is that it helps keep your loans down because you're earning money to help pay as you go, but you're also creating connections with the local bar or with potential future long-term employers when you're going to be an associate. So plan to work while you're in school. Gifts. I thought a student, and this is kind of an example that attaches to the school visits one, and I had a student a number of years ago who did crowdsourcing before crowdsourcing was a thing. It was quite a while ago, but I thought it was brilliant. She basically told everybody in her kind of immediate circle of family and friends that once she started law school, she didn't want them to any longer give her traditional gifts for her birthday or religious holidays or anniversaries or things of that nature. She said, give me a gift card for either Amazon or the bookstore. And she said between, her parents often giving her the biggest gifts for Christmas and her birthday in the kind of hundreds of dollars category, to siblings that gave her pretty nice little ones, $50, $75, to friends who would give her, $10, $15, $25 gifts, that over the course of the year, she would always get like $2,000 worth of these gift cards, so she never had to pay for books. So that over the course of law school, that added up to almost $6,000, and that was really helpful to her. She says it was a pain in the butt. She had a bag where she kept all the cards, and paying with multiple cards, but it paid off for her. Now with crowdsourcing, you can just have a website where you tell people just pitch in if you can. But gifts can be very helpful. And then if you want gift ideas beside just crowdsourcing, you can say, well, can you help me with my bar review course? Looking forward, Mom and Dad, can I skip this year's Christmas gift and know that my bar review course is going to be $1,100? Can you help pay for that? Be creative and don't be shy about asking for help along the way. Human resources and VA benefits. Are there any veterans in here? Any spouses or dependents of veterans? Okay, we'll skip that. So know that if your spouse or your parent has the post 9/11 GI Bill that includes the Yellow Ribbon Program, it can be assigned to you. So if they're not using that education benefit, if you are a spouse or a dependent of that person, they can assign that benefit to you. You'll need to talk to them about it and to the VA, but that's a possibility.
Is that even if the full 10 years? Because they came up with this rule where if you didn't serve for, I think it's 10 years, then your GI benefit could only stay with you. It couldn't be passed on. And
that may have been a more recent change, but when the program initially started, it was All you had to do was have 36 months of active duty, and you qualify for the 100% benefit, and that benefit could be assigned to another.
Okay.
As we have been engaged in war for as long as we have, I could foresee that they've added caveats to that in terms of limiting where it could go. But I think it's worth the time just to ask the question.
Okay.
For human resources for those who are around you. My college undergrad roommate, her father I went to college in Texas. Her father was a refinery worker for Texaco, and they had a union or an employees organization where they had a little scholarship fund for the employees, but the employees' children could also apply for it. So she actually got a pretty big scholarship from the Texaco Employees Fund when she went off to law school. So ask people around you if they belong to organizations and things that you may qualify as a spouse or a dependent for that program. The other thing is, if you have a spouse that will be traveling with you to law school or be with you in law school, have them consider, especially if you're moving, to look for a job at the university where you're attending law school. A lot of universities have human resource benefits that include tuition waivers or discounts for their employees spouses, and their dependents. A good example is the University of Utah. Here at the University of Utah, we have a tuition benefit for employees that kicks in 9 months after they've been employed, and after 1 year of employment, it kicks in for their spouse. So if a person's spouse got a job here in August of their first year, August of their second year, they would get half tuition off. It's a 50% waiver. So our tuition for non-residents is $38,000 a year, and for residents, it's $29,000 a year. So that's $15,000 per year that you can get discounted just by being an employee. And then on top of that, retirement, insurance, things like that. So a lot of times campuses are good places to work, and it could be a great place for a spouse to work if that's an option to consider. Then there's the human resource benefit for you. Keep in mind that when you go to law school, you're credentialed. You have an undergraduate degree and you're a graduate student. That allows you to work as a research assistant or teaching assistant in other departments. It can sometimes be challenging to get those jobs in law school, but keep in mind in other departments, they like law students because often those students are among the more competitive in their programs. So look for those jobs. Those will often come with tuition waivers in addition to the salary, and sometimes you'll have an office in another building on campus, so that can be beneficial. My one caution about those jobs is if they're not legally oriented, if you did that throughout law school and didn't get a job in a law firm or a public service agency where you were actually doing law work, it may create challenging questions when you are interviewing for a law job about why you don't have that experience as a student. Okay? But my goal here is for you to think about options that may help you in paying some of these costs. Okay. Now loans. I've already talked about living like a lawyer and then having to live like a student when you're a lawyer. So that goes to not borrowing all that you can. Know what you just need to borrow. There's two big differences there. And that cost of attendance budget should not be a goal to borrow every year. That's the limit. You should always be borrowing slightly less. If you end up needing more money to get you through the school year, you can always go back to the financial aid office and say, I want to borrow what I'm eligible for. Okay? You can always go back and ask for more. But you should always borrow a little bit less than your cost of attendance budget. And just to be clear, I've already talked about the cost of attendance budget, but some people often think that financial aid is only there for tuition. And no, it's for all costs associated as determined by the cost of attendance budget for school. The good news for those of you who have been on financial aid to get through undergraduate school is for the federal financial aid programs and for our law school, you don't need to collect your parents' tax information. You're automatically considered independent in the filing of federal forms, even if you're still living at home, and even if your parents still consider you as a tax dependent. So that's good news for you. Put it another way, you're going to look poor. You're going to look poorer as a student, and for need-based aid, that's what you want to do. Okay. So your loan options: there's unsubsidized direct loans, graduate plus loans, institutional loans, and private loans. I encourage students to stay away from the private loans at this stage. It doesn't have the benefits of the federal loan programs. The interest rates are competitive right now because they are fairly low. We're still in a fairly low interest rate era, but The interest rates that they charge you are variable, and they can be readjusted quarterly, and they have no cap. And so if we hit a highly inflationary cycle, you can find that you're paying a much higher interest rate than this, I'll call it quasi-fixed federal rate. We'll talk about that in a minute. Some institutions have loans. Some universities have their own loan programs, and a lot of them are pretty good, and a lot of them mimic the federal programs. So if you're offered one of those, investigate it. Know the benefits of the federal loan program. I think that some of the best benefits are the repayment options. It's also what makes it confusing, though. But also there is the death and disability benefit. If you happen to pass away or become 100% disabled, you can have your federal student loans canceled. You don't have to pay them back. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the repayment options. Federal direct subsidized, unsubsidized loans. That's what students are. It's an entitlement loan. I call it an entitlement loan. You get it as long as you're not in default on a federal student loan or a federal loan at this point. You can get $20,500 per year. So you know today that you've got $61,500 available to you through the federal loan program. Pretty much no questions asked. Well, they ask you questions on the form, but you're going to get the money. There's no credit check. The interest rate is capped at 9.5, but they calculate it every year for whatever you borrow that year. For example, this is the class, this is what students who borrow money this year are paying in interest rate. So for the class that is graduating in May 2020, our 3Ls, when they started law school, the interest rate on the first $20,500 they borrowed was 6%. And for that $20,500, that 6% is for the life of that loan. And then when they borrowed the next $20,500 during their second year, that interest rate for that $20,500 was at 6.595. And that's what it will be for that $20,000 for the life of that loan. And this year when they borrowed some money for last year, lucky them, it dropped again. And it's at 6.079. I don't like this system. It makes it hard for you guys to calculate total debt once you pay it off and everything, because you don't know what your future interest rate is going to be. But this is the system that we work in. So always keep an eye out around July when we come up with when these numbers are disclosed to know what you're going to be paying for that year's interest rates. Okay. The second kind of loan. So if you're going to school here, the total cost of attendance for residents is about $50,000 a year. $30,000 of that is tuition, $20,000 is room, board, books, all that other stuff, right? If you don't get a scholarship from us and all you get is that $20,000 loan, you're saying, how do I get the other $30,000 to pay for law school? You get it with a Grad Plus loan. There is not a numerical cap on this loan, but it serves as a bridge to help you meet the total cost of attendance. So your eligibility of this Grad Plus loan is the cost of attendance minus any other aid you're getting. And then this makes up the difference. There is a slight credit check. I'll talk to you about it on this loan. The cap is 1 point higher, 10.5%, and it's a slightly higher formula so that the interest rate rule is the same, but it's a little bit higher for this particular loan, okay? The credit check is not one where they're looking at your FICO score. What they're looking at is whether you have what's called an adverse credit history, which means are you delinquent more than 3 months on any kind of debt? So if you're late 3 months on any kind of debt, you're not going to qualify for the loan. The good news about checking on this adverse credit history is you can rehabilitate that fairly quickly. You can make some phone calls to creditors and say, just put me 2 months back or what have you, and you're going to qualify. Or you can get co-signers. But they run this credit check every year. So if you get the creditor to say you're only delinquent 2 months, you're going to have to catch up on those loans payments by the time your next year's loan paperwork comes around, because they're going to run that credit check again. You don't have to mess with that. All right? But this money's a bridge loan, slightly stricter requirements. All right. Straightforward there, kind of on the costs, on meeting costs associated with school, the loan programs, things to think about scholarship. Any questions? Okay. Last year, this is that fifth year of that 5-year program. This is part number 3, that year of licensing. It's going to look a lot like that year of sitting for the bar exam and applying to law school. You're applying to become a licensed attorney. There's an exam. It's not the LSAT. It's the bar. There's test prep. Guess who's in the test prep business for bar exams? Kaplan, right? Same companies. And it's about $1,000. If you're going to need to move to your new job, there's expenses associated with that, living expenses, work expenses, loan payments. You're not going to immediately go into repayment unless you have undergraduate debt that you use the grace period on. If you use all your grace period for undergraduate debt, then you do go into repayment as soon as you graduate from law school on that debt, but not on the law school debt, okay? But you will go into repayment. Considering life insurance and bankruptcy, I want to mention these things. Remember I alluded to the fact that one of the benefits of the federal loan program is that it has the cancellation on death and disability. That's good news. But that's a rule of the Department of Education. The IRS looks at it differently. The IRS says this, we consider this a taxable event. They look at it as a gift to your estate. That if you're one of those people and so I'm talking to people who, when they're considering that adverse debt number, they're like, I'm cool with $200,000. That's fine. But if something happens to you and you have $200,000 of debt and it's canceled, your estate owes $60,000 in taxes. So what some people do to address that, if they have a really high level of education debt, is get life insurance early in their career so that if something happens, there's enough life insurance to cover that tax debt. And then as you pay down your debt, then you can either reduce the life insurance or just change the beneficiary on that. But something to consider if you are a high debt borrower. And then bankruptcy. Student loans won't go away if you file bankruptcy. There is a small provision in the bankruptcy code that does allow for the cancellation of student debt, but nobody ever gets that. I mean, it's a very high threshold. It's basically that there's no way that you can ever earn a living based on the area of study. And so you guys are all young, healthy, and good-looking enough to where a judge would look at you in bankruptcy court and say, no, go get a job. Okay? So just know student loans won't get canceled in bankruptcy. Loan repayment options. We'll go quickly through this, partly because this is going to change while you're in school. This is really going to change based on the next election. So this is what exists right now. And know that this is where some of the biggest changes in higher ed legislation are always made. But right now there's two broad categories of repayment options. One is based on how much debt you have, and they basically calculate, look at that debt, look at your interest, and create what's called an amortization chart, and say over the next 10 to 20 years, depending on which repayment option you have, this is how much you pay every month. Then there's another category based on income-driven repayment options. And those repayment options aren't based all on how much debt you have. It doesn't matter whether you have $25,000 of debt or $500,000 of debt. It's based on how much you earn annually. Okay? And that's what gives people the option, I think, to do public service work right now or do lower paying jobs, and gives you a little bit of a cushion in terms of looking at law school and being worried about the cost. You can always have a repayment option that financially won't stress your monthly budget, because the cost of your student loan repayment is always going to be sensitive to that, if that's the repayment option you have. I already alluded to this. Based on debt, you can have fixed payments. If you go standard, graduating payments will increase slightly every 2 years. Extended will go up to 25 years. Extended graduated, also 25 years. But you follow an amortization chart, and you know what's going to be happening every year for whatever year you've chosen on that. Okay. Income-driven are based on your income. The driving word in those it's discretionary fund. There is a federal formula that says it's about 150% of the poverty rate. It's basically your adjusted gross, 15 or 10% of your adjusted gross income is the formula, and I'll show you that in a minute. If you choose this, though, it's like being in the financial aid system as an adult. You're going to have to report back to the loan servicer what your salary is every year and give them documentation to show what it is so they can adjust what your calculation is. So if you're earning more than the last year, your payments are going to go up. If you're earning less, your payments are going to go down, but you're going to have to turn in paperwork every year. And that is affected by not only your salary, but also your family size. These are the various options: 10%, 15%, and 20% of income. There's some legislation out there that's talking about it being 15% or 20%, depending on which party you're looking at. But these are the various ones. It's 150% of federal poverty guidelines in terms of that discretionary. The two ones I want to focus on right now, or the one I want to focus on, is called the REPAY. PAYE stands for pay as you earn, The refers to, it was a change made from the first pay system established about 5 years ago. So if you heard a little bit about this, it has changed. And so the thing is, it's 10% discretionary, but it's high and low. It used to be only, they would look at what your payment would have been if you were in a standard 10-year repayment, and you would never have to pay more than that. They got rid of that provision. They say regardless of what it's strictly based on what you're earning. So if you have a really good year and you have $1 million contingency fee that hits, and you get $500,000 of that, your annual income $500,000, whatever the adjusted gross income is on that is going to be what is calculated for your high end on that. Okay, it's 15% of that adjusted gross income. So for high earning families, that makes it a tough one, because you may have one low earning spouse who's doing public interest work, but if you have a professional spouse who's also doing high earnings, they look at both incomes and use the calculation, and it can go higher. That's the biggest difference there. This is one of the payments that qualifies for public service loan forgiveness. I'm going to speed through the slides after this, but this I think is the best slide to show the example of the difference between standard income-driven repayment and standard repayment. Under standard repayment is based on the debt. So if you are that kind of typical private school graduate and you have $125,000 of debt, and you choose the standard 10-year repayment option, your monthly payment is going to be about $1,400 a month. It's mortgage. Okay? If you are an attorney working in public interest making $50,000 a year, it doesn't matter what your debt is. If your debt was $100,000, though, you'd be paying that standard. But earning $50,000, if it's just you living by yourself, your monthly payment's $265. Regardless of how much debt. If there's 2 people, it drops to $211. 3 people, it's $157. So that's a really good chart, I think, to show you the differences between the 2 broad categories of repayment. The one based on how much debt you have and what your income is. The thing about these programs is you can switch between them. Just know that to qualify for public service loan forgiveness, you have to be in the income-driven ones. It has to either be the repay or pay. And this is one of the things, and this is where, if you want to play with some of this information, go to studentloans.gov. And like I said, I'll send you guys these slides. They'll get to you in about a week. But this points to you where you need to go. If you don't have an account set up, you need to set up an account. But then you can go, and then you can go to the repayment calculator and pay with some of these. And one of the coolest things about it is this page, where you can choose, look at the standard repayment based on various salary ranges all the way down. Okay. So, safety nets. Make sure you stay in touch with your loan servicer. If you find yourself in financial straits, you can always request deferment or forbearance. If you get that, your credit's not going to take a hit, because this is a legal option available to you. And if you're in this category, it's not going to affect your credit score, because you've done the paperwork to say, I'm just taking a break. Public service loan forgiveness is forgiveness set up for you to have loans forgiven after 120 months of qualifying service. But that service has to be in qualifying repayment choices, income-driven, and in qualifying employment. Any kind of government work or 501c3 nonprofit agencies. Those are the things that you have to be in. Any others at this point not really going to qualify. You must satisfy both conditions. Pros are it's a great opportunity if you're in public service and you're committed to it for the long term. Con is the biggest con is it's an all or nothing process. If you don't do the full 120 payments or 10 years, and it's actually 120 payments, because if you take a break at 100 payments and have a kid or go to the private sector for a little while and then come back, then you still have more time that you have to put in until you've done 120 payments. If you don't get to that 120 payments, you get no forgiveness. It's not pro rata. All right, it's all or nothing. The biggest problem right now is the way the program is being administered. You may have seen some of the news reports in the last couple of weeks that the Department of Ed has dropped the ball. Just last year, 2 years ago, in 2017, was the first group of people who qualified for public service loan forgiveness, or were supposed to. The way the Department of Ed in their loan service setting was processing it, upwards of 95% of the people who filed for it were declined. the request, and this is a huge controversy right now. And so I don't know what to say, because this is just an example of the federal government, in my opinion, dropping the ball, or people getting bad advice. That some of the people thought that they were in the right repayment option, and it turns out they weren't, and so they didn't dot the i's or double check what they were supposed to be in. Or people took a break to have a kid or go into another sector of the job market, and then didn't go back and change the paperwork to say, I now want to be in the income-driven repayment mode. So there are some issues that are the fault of the borrowers, but my opinion and what I've read, it's mostly the fault of the Department of Ed. And Congress tried to fix it, and the fix didn't work either. So keep aware of it and keep informed. This is one of the things that will matter in the next election. So don't be passive. One of the things I hope I hit home with is this is an important part of the decision-making process of going to law school. You can't just sit back and say, I'll fill out the paperwork and ask for the money. You need to keep on top of it. And this isn't a passive endeavor. Have a 3-part plan. How are you dealing with admissions, school, and licensing? It's a little complicated, but you want to go to law school, you can do complicated. When you get this, there's a bunch of websites I can give you, including some of these loan calculators. Any questions? I know it was a little scary, but was it helpful? We'll go out and go to law school.